Today we're taking a look at something we all encounter, but that plays out in, well, wildly different ways around the world. Alcohol.
That's right.
You shared some really insightful material on how various countries approach drinking, and our goal today is sort of to unpack these unique
And
styles.
understand the why behind them. Yeah,
Exactly. Hopefully giving you a richer perspective on global social customs.
definitely. And the sources you provided, they cover a fascinating range. We'll be touching on the United States, France, Germany, England, Sweden, Brazil, South Korea, and Japan, too.
Quite the list.
It is. It's going to be a really interesting exploration, I think, of how culture shapes something as seemingly simple as, having a drink.
Okay, sounds great. Let's dive in, maybe start with the United States. What struck you about their approach?
Well, what's interesting there is how casual it seems and quite individualistic.
Individualistic, how so?
Drinking often revolves around specific social events,
Mhm.
like bars, parties, BBQs.
Yeah, not so much integrated into the workday, generally.
Exactly. Less so than in some other cultures we'll get to. It kind of fits with those broader American values of, independence, personal choice.
That makes sense. And yeah, you can't really ignore the big three: beer, cocktails, wine. They seem pretty central.
For sure.
Plus that really strict drinking age, 21, and the ID checks you always hear about. That's definitely a feature.
Absolutely. A
Yeah.
defining one. And while the sources mention binge drinking, especially in like college culture,
Totally the classic image.
yeah, but it also notes that tends to decrease later on. And interestingly, there seems to be growing acceptance socially for just not drinking.
Oh, that's a good point. So maybe a shift happening there.
Seems possible, yeah. It suggests an evolution, perhaps?
Okay, so from that more structured, maybe individual approach, let's journey over to France. What's the story there? Feels different.
Oh, France is a really compelling contrast, absolutely. Their approach is often described as, well, refined and really interwoven with meals.
Integrated, you mean?
Deeply integrated. It feels less about just the consumption, and more about the enjoyment, flavors, traditions.
Right, like the central role of wine. You hear about wine with lunch, dinner, even on a Tuesday. That paints a very different picture.
It really does. Think about the history of the agriculture there.
Mm.
Wine is just so ingrained. It's not really about getting drunk.
Less about intoxication, more enhancing the meal.
Precisely. Moderation is a really key aspect. And being publicly drunk is generally frowned upon. Big time.
So it really highlights a different cultural value placed on alcohol, savored
Yeah.
responsibly.
Exactly. Not just consumed to excess.
Okay, fascinating. Now let's head north a bit to Germany. Beer. That's the first word that springs to mind usually.
And for good reason, right? Germany's beer culture is, well, it's iconic. You've got the beer gardens, Oktoberfest, those massive steins.
Yeah, hard to ignore.
And beer is just really integrated into daily life. It's widely available. You can even get it on trains.
Wow, yeah, that's quite a contrast to the US where, open container laws can be quite strict in public.
Big difference.
But it sounds like despite beer being everywhere, there's a generally responsible attitude.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. While it's accessible, you don't commonly see widespread public intoxication.
Right.
There's a kind of relaxed attitude, less stigma around having a beer.
But it doesn't necessarily lead to chaos.
Typically not, no. Generally, responsible habits seem the norm.
Okay, interesting. So, from German beer gardens, let's hop across the channel to England. The pub sounds like it's more than just a bar.
Oh, absolutely. The pub in England is a real social hub. It's
Yeah.
central. People
Yeah.
gather there, connect, talk, relax. Sometimes even get a bit of work done, apparently.
A cornerstone of community life, almost.
You could say that, yeah.
And the drinks seem pretty classic pub fare. Pints of beer, cider. Gin's big too, right?
Definitely. Pints, cider, G&Ts. And that rounds culture is fascinating.
Ah, yes, taking turns buying for the group.
Exactly. That unwritten rule, it really builds a sense of camaraderie.
Yeah, I can see that.
But the sources also point out that binge drinking, it's still pretty prevalent, especially weekends and maybe younger crowds.
So there's a tension there between the social tradition and maybe heavier drinking bouts.
It seems so, an interesting mix. But it's also worth noting, like in the U.S., there's this emerging sober, curious thing happening too,
Right, suggesting attitudes might be shifting there as well.
which just shows, again, these cultures aren't static, are they? They evolve, even with really long traditions.
Good point. Okay, now let's head north again. Scandinavia. Sweden. This sounds quite different. The word used was almost controlled.
Yes, Sweden definitely presents a more regulated picture. Alcohol is quite expensive there, and it's mainly sold in these state-run stores, the Systembolaget.
Systembolaget, right. That must shape things significantly.
It really does. It has historical roots, temperance movements, and kind of fits their social welfare model. It makes drinking less spontaneous, perhaps.
More of a planned activity than just grabbing a drink on a whim.
Exactly. And you see this interesting pattern. Sometimes people might be quite sober during the week, but then drink more heavily on
A
weekends.
bit of a release valve, maybe?
Perhaps. And while public drunkenness might be, let's say, more tolerated during big celebrations like midsummer,
Right, specific occasions.
yeah, but generally it carries a definite social stigma.
So it's almost like there are designated times for letting loose, but a stricter code otherwise.
That sums it up pretty well, yeah.
Okay, from the cooler climes of Sweden, let's jump somewhere warmer. Brazil. Festive is the word that comes to mind.
Ah, Brazil. Yes, the drinking culture there just sounds so vibrant. Really connected to socializing, dancing, just enjoying life.
Ice cold beer, cachaça, the caipirinhas. The drinks themselves feel like part of the celebration.
They absolutely are. And the way people often drink, slowly, socially, maybe at a street bar or on the beach.
With music, dancing.
Often, yes. It paints this picture of alcohol as a social lubricant, but in a very relaxed, joyful way.
Feels like a world away from some of the more regulated approaches we've discussed.
It really does. It just emphasizes how much cultural context shapes this whole relationship with alcohol.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift eastward now. South Korea. Here, it sounds like drinking has this really significant role in social dynamics, especially work.
That's a really key point for South Korea. It's highly social, often quite ritualistic. It's seen as crucial for building relationships, particularly professionally.
The hosik,
Yeah.
the company dinner or outing.
Exactly, wosik. And they often revolve heavily around drinking. It's about bonding with colleagues, with the boss.
And the drinks soju, beer, often mixed, right? Somek.
Yeah, somek, soju and beer, is incredibly common at these gatherings.
Almost synonymous with socializing there.
Pretty much. And you have drinking games. Specific etiquette, like turning away from elders when you drink, is a sign of respect. It shows how structured it can be, even when it's lively.
Right, the rituals matter.
They do. And while heavy drinking, especially in those work settings, has been, common,
There's maybe a change.
yeah, there are signs, particularly among younger generations, of a trend towards more moderation. But that collectivist approach, especially around work, is still a big contrast to, say, the U.S.
Fascinating how it's so embedded in the social, even professional fabric. Not just unwinding, but relationship building.
Absolutely. It really underlines the different functions alcohol can serve in society.
Okay, one more stop on our tour. Japan. Described as respectful, orderly, but can get lively too.
Japan offers another really unique angle. A bit like South Korea, drinking is important for bonding professionally and personally.
The nomikai, the after-work gathering.
Yes, nomikai. It's often seen as maybe not mandatory, but a strong cultural expectation in many workplaces, building team cohesion.
And the drinks, beer, sake, shochu, very tied to Japanese traditions themselves.
Exactly, integral parts of the culture. But what's really interesting is this apparent paradox.
Go on.
Well, there seems to be a relatively higher tolerance for public drunkenness compared to many Western countries. You might see people sleeping it off on a train, for instance.
Yeah. Really? Okay.
But at the same time, there's a huge emphasis on social etiquette while drinking. Like, you don't pour your own drink, you pour for others and they pour for you. It's about respect, hierarchy.
So a balance between letting loose collectively and maintaining social harmony through rules.
That's a great way to put it. It's a nuanced balance, a collective experience, even when it gets quite spirited.
Wow. Okay, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive, covering so much ground.
It really has.
It's just so clear, isn't it? Something as universal as having a drink is just so deeply tangled up with culture, values, social norms.
Completely. What seems like a simple act carries all this weight, all this meaning and tradition, depending on where you are.
And when you think about the bigger picture, it really highlights how culture shapes, well, everything. Even choices that feel really personal.
Understanding these nuances just gives such a richer view of, human social dynamics, how we interact.
Definitely. So thinking about all these incredibly different ways of approaching alcohol and socializing, what aspects really resonate with you listening in?
Yeah, what parts maybe connect with your own perspective.
Or were there any cultural bits that really surprised you? And maybe why?
It certainly makes you think, doesn't it? About the role alcohol plays in our own lives and those often unspoken rules we follow.